Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Autumn 2022 Open Lectures brought to you by the University of York. I am Marjorie Coughlin and I'm chairing this evening's session, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event. This lecture is part of York Disability Week, a week-long programme of events taking place within Disability History Month and supported by York Human Rights City Network. This programme coincides with the UN International Day of Persons with Disabilities on 3rd of December, the aim of which is to promote the human rights and well-being of people who identify as disabled or as having an impairment in all spheres of society and increases awareness of their situation in every aspect of political, social, economic and cultural life. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce Selina Mills, who will be speaking to us tonight. Selina is a writer, journalist and activist raising awareness about the lives of blind people and creating a new platform for our historical understanding of blindness. She has regularly contributed to the BBC, featuring on the Disability A New History podcast series, and has spoken many times about the importance and impact of audio description in filmmaking. And we're going to see some of that in action today. She was responsible for co-writing what is considered to be the first accessible opera libretto, which premiered in 2018 and was performed, well, it had a national tour across the UK this year. And actually, if you're lucky, you can catch it on the Grey Eye website because they're live streaming it as part of Disability Week. So I recommend that you head across and download that to watch. The opera is about the composer Maria Theresa von Paradis, who Selina will actually be talking a little bit about this evening. And Selina also recently contributed to a project that I'm involved with, which is a sculpture project with St Paul's Cathedral, in which we have a project called 50 Monuments in 50 Voices. So I really recommend that you, after the talk tonight, you head over and have a look at that very beautiful piece by Selina for that project. So Selina, over to you, and thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Marjorie. That was, I didn't do all that, but thank you very, very much for having me, and thank you to the University of York and the Festival of Ideas. I have very many happy memories of being in York, and I'm so sorry not to be there tonight in the city itself, and I definitely will be coming back. So good evening, everyone, and hope you are having something like a warm mug of tea or something slightly stronger in a glass, and on this rather winter's chilly night. Before I begin, what I thought we'd do a little online experiment, and please don't feel that you have to do this at all. If you don't want to, that's absolutely fine. But what I'd like you to do is, just for one moment, put whatever's in your hands down and look at the screen and close your eyes. And I want you to imagine what it's like to be blind in your own head. Right, open your eyes. So the reason I made you do that was because I want to really ask, what is blindness? And was that what we just did, blindness? And as you'll see from the next slide, blindness is such a huge, word. Oh, wrong slide, but anyway, my fault. But there we go, that one. According to the World Health Organization, it's estimated that something like 250 million people are blind in the world, but only 36 million have complete blindness. So our notion of blindness is actually quite confused. Like this tiny one word, 4-letter word, actually covers a huge spectrum. And if you really get bored one day, you can go and look at the World Health Organization, and they will tell you I'm one of 217 million people who have moderate to severe sight impairment. So it's very hard. I never, when I started writing this book and doing this research, I didn't know how to place myself. Am I blind? Am I visually impaired? Where do I fit? And the problem is the word blind and blindness is quite a confusing word. So the previous slide, which I so sorry put in, why am I interested in this subject? So I already had bad eyesight, but it was totally functional. But in my 30s, just so you know, there's a picture of me on this slide in a blue sweater with a white shirt and a hat on, which is my sort of trademark, in front of a load of books. I started losing my real sight in my 30s. And the thing I found very strange was how people reacted to me. So people who had known me all my life, and they were confused. Sometimes they were like, oh my God, you've got to get fixed. You've got to get fixed. And I literally had people ringing me up with, I said, doctor in Cuba, you've got to go there. Or there was pity. Oh, you poor thing, how terrible. Horror. And at the other end, catastrophic. Oh my God, this is the worst thing that could ever happen to you. And I guess I wanted to know why we had these reactions, because in one sense it would be, yes, it's true, something doesn't work, but actually my life in many respects was okay. So I got really confused about how others treated me. So let's go back to, so I started thinking, what is blindness? And most people in the sighted world think when they close their eyes, that's exactly what blindness is. It's sort of pinky dark, usually dark is the word that comes to our minds. And just closing our eyes will give this moment of insight into what it's like to be able to not see. And most sighted people, and myself included, for a long time, thought of blindness as darkened, blackness, obscurity, or at least murky fogginess. And added to that already quite complicated thought is that blindness was frightening. Indeed, any mention of the word blind or blindness comes with a sort of elusive coat of mystery and intrigue. Either, and then we can look at our next slide, I think, maybe, hopefully, blindness is perceived as debilitating, with people with their arms stretched out, groping in the dark, passive, miserable, and possibly have to be really grateful for whatever morsels the sighted world gives them. Let's go to the next slide, I think, if we can. Yeah, so there we go. So this is 1568 Bruegel, wonderful painter. And for many millennia, this picture, which is of 5 blind people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think there's one in the ditch, leading each other, their arms stretched out, and they're all groping towards each other's shoulders. And then the first one has fallen in a ditch. And it's a very, very well-known image of blind people. And that's from 1568. So you can have the falling in the ditch, and I call that the burden, the terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. If we go to the next one, next slide, here we have a picture of a man standing at the top of, I think, Mount Everest. And this man is called Eric Wiedemeyer. I can't pronounce his name properly, sorry. And who in 2001, he stood on the top of Everest, and he was the first blind man to do so. And he's in a helmet with all the climbing kit and a hat, a helmet on, bright yellow hat. And so the other side of blindness is this inspiring side. And even in our less damning and supposedly sort of more liberal times, and we have clear legal definitions of, and we live in a world where we have canes and technology and guide dogs, we still think of blindness as tragic. It's a very interesting thought, and it's a clinical condition, or it's a tragic condition, or it's an inspiring condition. So next slide, please. So I decided to do a bit of hunting. And I was at the time a journalist at the Daily Telegraph, and then I became a journalist at the BBC. And I started quietly at the weekends going to the library, and I got some amazing help from a man called Clive at the British Library. All hail Clive. And there is so little history out there for blind people that is not triumphant So this is my, on your left now we have a slide that says Triumph Over Darkness, the life of Louis Braille. And there are tons of books like this, particularly between 1920 and 1970, sort of tons of books of how blind people have overcome their tragic, terrible circumstance. The next slide will also show a book, I think. So the next slide is just the back of a book which I find in the London Library, and it was the most read book in the Harvard Library in 1956, when it was called The Story of Blindness by Gabriel Farrell, and he was working in Boston as the head of Perkins Institute for the Blind. So he was very, very well acquainted with blind people, the blind community, and he, in the back of the book, had the blurb. Farrell stresses the economic provision that must be made for the blind. And he tells us how the blind have been helped overcome their deficiencies in various ways. So consistently, we are constantly told, even in the history of blindness, in the representation of blind people, that it's something to be overcome. Next slide, please. And for me, the real question is, well, why does it evoke so much emotion? Other disabilities do too, but blindness, bizarrely, is one of the top fears we have. And in a recent survey done by the RNIB and the University of Baltimore, when people were asked what was worse, blindness, cancer, or AIDS, blindness came top. Hooray! And that was my first question. But the second question was, but where are these blind voices? Like, so we've had thousands of years of people being blind. Why don't we know about them? So I think that's how really I got to this point where I just thought I really need to know not only why people react how they do now, but also where did that come from and how long have we had that? Is it something recent? Is it something long? And I also just wanted to know how to handle people treating me differently. I was the same person, and yet I was being treated differently simply because I had a cane. I've also, I mean, there's a whole list. I have a whole list here of fantasies that people have a black blindness. So from you're compensated, you've got great touch. There is, you know, apparently I'm going to be a really good lover. Because I'm losing my sight, which is great. And there's a plethora of sighted writers, especially in the 20th century, but also the 19th century, who use blindness as a drama to enhance the plot, particularly Dickens, who I've got H.G. Wells, Dickens, Emily Bronte, Andre Gide, Hans Christian Andersen, and more recently, we've got John Wyndham and Jose Saramago. So you've got these sort of really brilliant, wonderful sighted writers using the fantasy of blindness as a means to push a plot on. And the other thing that I found was it seems that blind people themselves have perpetuated myths as well. And part of this is economic. People need to sort of live and so to write your story. And because blindness is considered so over there in the corner, different and separate, biography has gone a long way. And so in modern times, we've got Helen Keller's The Story of My Life in 1903. We've got The Art of Seeing by Aldous Huxley in 1942. I did not know, but he had periods of blindness. Ved Mehta's Sound Shadows in 1986. And more recently, there are quite a few memoirs about the people climbing Everest. My favorite one is Rachel Skudoris, the American dog musher and cross-country runner who became the first blind person to complete the 16,000 kilometer Iditarod sled trail across Alaska. I mean, I'm sorry, I just like, why would you do that? It's cold. But anyway, apart from understanding that people need these events, blind or not, even from a cursory scan, I think it made me realize like the symbols that blindness is, again, this symbol of triumph over adversity or, you know, extreme pity. And it bothered me. So what I thought I'd do now is talk you through a couple of examples in different time periods and show you not only their story, but why it matters. So I think we've got the next slide. again, so this is, sorry, that was the question. I was like, you know, where are these blind people? And that's why I'm doing this talk, is to try and share more voices. Next slide, please. So I must introduce you here to a slide of a skull. For some people, it will be reminiscent of Hamlet and Yorick, but for others, it's simply a computer-generated skull, which is of Nandi, a Neanderthal. And I first came across him at an alumni dinner at university, and some of my tutors asked me, you know, how's your eyesight? And I was like, yes, well, yes, it's fine. I'm still at the Telegraph, blah, blah, blah. I also told them stories about my false eye, because everyone's, you know, wants to make it laughter and easy. And I said, oh, yes, you know, I went to my bank manager, my false eye fell out. And the bank manager said, oh, you must keep a better eye on your finances. And, you know, we all roared with laughter. But one of the things that happened was after we sort of chatted vivaciously about my false eye, we started talking, and this one very snotty professor, sorry, professors, said, oh, well done for keep going. I said, thank you. And he said, and then one said, I was lucky to be alive in the 21st century, because in the 19th century, he said, with certitude, you would have been consigned to an institution or workhouse, or if you were more fortunate, lived at home in spinsterhood. And a medical student got really excited, and she said, oh yes, the blind would have not met the fitness criteria of Darwinian theorists, and you would have very likely died in the workhouse if you're very poor, or an infection after a quack intervention. You know, and everybody listened to that and said nothing, which I found really disturbing. But then this one woman who I absolutely adore, and she's still with us, was an elderly, warm, round lady at the end of the table. And she said, and she's a stately archaeologist, that's key here. If you had been a Neanderthal, you might have been revered and treated with great honor, even outlived your peers. And we all went, what? And she said, in 1961, in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, she told us, on the borders of Turkey, a group of archaeologists discovered the burial site of male skeletons dated to 50,000 years ago. And one skeleton was called, the official name was Shandidar I, which is the the title we have on the slide, which is just the name of him. And he was called Nandi. And Nandi showed a crushing blow to the head and some severe deformity, particularly in his ears and his eye sockets. And the modern methods of testing showed that he had a bone disease, disease in his bones, which would definitely have rendered him at least partially sighted, but probably blind. And he had a withered leg as well. And you would kind of think in a hunter-gathering world, this would mean that he would have been dead. He couldn't get up, he couldn't leave the cave. And yet, this is the weird bit, remarkably, unlike his peers who died in their 20s and they were all buried by the river, he was by the cave, and the carbon dating of Nandi's proved that he died when he was 45. So someone, somewhere, and the professor said this, not me, fed and watered blind Nandi. And we all sort of nodded and went, oh, yes, 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 yes. But I think what I thought about when I came home was, it's kind of amazing he existed. He was 45, he was 50,000 years ago. And it's sort of like a wave from the past. And just knowing that he was there, had lived and functioned with blindness 50,000 years ago, it sort of gave me a sense of sort of shared human experience and a connection which is utterly cheering. And, you know, despite the fact that I had been drinking at the alumni dinner, I found myself that it had totally, that tiny bit of information changed how I felt about myself. And I found that, you know, really interesting. But there's one thing that really puzzled me, and this is what I find very interesting about looking at blind history, is that we're presuming quite a lot here. So there was no evidence that other Neanderthals had engaged with Nandi. We don't know if he had a special burial or just simply died in the cave. There were no oaths, no images, no graffiti on the wall. So how did this professor, this archaeologist, know that Nandi was revered, as she says? Why did we, as a group of sort of overeducated, well-intentioned folks, presume to go along with this idea? After all, maybe Nandi had simply been a greedy, grunty, boring grunter who happened to, live by a berry tree in a river, which sustained him. If he was fed and cared for, maybe it was simply because everyone shared their bounty. So it's interesting how you project onto objects and people and ideas from your own point of view. So where does that come from? And my next slide will hopefully give us a little bit of. So this is a slide, it's a statue, unknown author of Homer, with his eyes glazed over. It's a sort of Grecian and classical image with a man with a very big beard, seems to be wearing a toga, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong. And it's at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. There are quite a few images like this of Homer. So one of the questions I sort of find myself thinking is like, where do we get this idea of projecting onto blind people? And I'd like to blame Homer completely. I can't, but let's just start with Homer. There's not one link or explanation why blindness is perceived as such a sort of an exceptional state or tragic state. But the first person we know in the Western tradition who had this is Homer. As the playwright Aeschylus wrote, all other literary works have come slices from the great banquet of Homer, and almost by all biographies tell us that he was blind. The general consensus is that Homer, the man, lived between the 8th and 7th century BC, but the epic compositions that we know so well today, the Odyssey and the Iliad, were not just created by him, but compositions that we know that were created by many, possibly a group of poets, possibly women too, who had a hand in the Odyssey and the Iliad. And why, details of his life remain murky. One thing that has been consistent is that he's considered blind. We have absolutely no proof of this. And we have other writers, but hundreds of years later, Thucydides, he says, for example, 300 years after his death, he said, there was a blind man dwelling on the rocky isle of Chios. And Herodotus and Aristotle also said that he was blind. He was blind, but seeing. And some classicists have said that his name actually means blindness in a particular local dialect. And archaeologists have dug up statues of Homer from about 5th and 6th century AD, and his eyes are half shut, which is an ancient suggestion of loss, of sight loss. So it's very interesting that we project this onto him. And it's really interesting that other poets, as time has passed, have taken on this mantle of the blind poet, as if it would make you a genius. So there's quite a few academics who fight about this, by the way, and I would happily, so if you really want a good afternoon reading, go and look up Harvard professors Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who went to the Balkans at the time, and they called it the Balkans, and in the 1930s, and they said, I don't think Homer was blind. They thought he was in a trance, because when people start repeating poetry in huge long tracts of poetry, they start closing their eyes and swaying their heads and going into a reverie. So their argument was, well, no, he wasn't blind. He was just, like this. And then other classicists have said that it was a PR strategy, which I like that, because it connects him to the gods. So, what better than being a poet and having this amazing insight and knowledge and power of gift of poetry from the gods? It kind of lifts you up. And it's very interesting that that idea has been picked up by other poets as time has gone by. So for an example, Renaissance poets, and the most famous one in Britain is Milton on his blindness. And its opening lines are very well known. When I consider how my life is spent, my light is spent. And he also has connected himself. He did go blind, and we know that. His daughter wrote about it. But it's interesting how he wasn't blind for most of his life, and yet that's often how people attach to him. And then I found some really interesting things. So Oscar Wilde wrote in the 19th century, I have sometimes thought that the story of Homer's blindness might really be an artistic myth created in critical days to remind us not merely of the great poet as a seer, but seeing with the eyes of seeing less with the eyes of the body and more with the eyes of the soul. He is a true singer, building his song out of music, repeating each line over and over again until he has caught the secret of its melody, chanting in the darkness the words that are winged with light. I mean, this is Oscar Wilde, thousands of years later. And what Wilde's really suggesting, and we seem to take this idea up, is that anything that enhances talent, such as being compensated, is, you know, in the same way that Homer was and the same way that Milton was, gives you this incredible gift. And actually, you kind of want it. And we've got a few other examples. I'll just quickly run over those. T.S. Eliot uses the character of Tiresias, who's blind in the wasteland, because despite being non-seeing, he can comment on the action and the transitional nature of man. As a blind seer, he's a plot device. He's seeing, not seeing, male, female. And he says this in the opening lines. I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives. So we have all this from Homer, because everyone, they attach themselves to it. And I would finally, my list of this is the Argentinian Nobel Prize winning Jorge Borges, who is 1899 to 1986. And he argued that blindness figured as a special state that grants its owner talent and skill. And he wrote this. He wrote a beautiful essay called Blindness. And there was a great irony, he said, of being a man of letters without sight and becoming the director of the National Library of Argentina. And so, like Oscar Wilde, like T.S. Eliot, he argued a blind poet was something mysterious and visionary about his work and his ideas. And yet, and here's the really interesting thing. In the last 10 years, quite a lot of blind poets have written. Stephen Cosisto, a woman called Georgina Klieg, who's a writer, have argued back and pushed back and said, no, actually, my talent, if I have any talent, it's because I have talent. It's not because I got this magical mystery blindness. And what I really think is interesting, of course, you know, Homer is a mythical character. Tiresias is a fictional character who appears throughout fictional pieces. But there's also an increasing amount of academic study, and I love this. It's there's a particular woman called Martha Rose, and she has written in The Staff of Oedipus that actually the notion, next slide, yes, is the next slide shows the cover of her book, which is called The Staff of Oedipus, and it's called Transforming Disability in Ancient Greece. She said, blindness to an audience in antiquity was a condition that could happen to anyone at any time. So it wasn't so special. I mean, it was just there. People did go blind. People got old. They got aging. They lost their sight, which is pretty normal. So I think that's what I really thought about the classical idea. Like, we've been fed this mythical story, and yet actually we're beginning to understand that actually, you know, everybody had blindness, or either, you know, somebody in the family, somebody who you knew, could happen at work. So it had an intellectual cut. So what I'm really trying to say here, and my first biggest point, is blindness had an intellectual currency, and it was consistently put in the forward. And I just want to sort of add this. This is not on my slides, but it's just a thought, which is we have that thought today. My American nephews point out to me that the extreme notions of the super compensated blind person in superheroes, and you can go into any streaming service and there's Marvel's Daredevil, who's a blind barrister by day but a superhero vigilante at night with special senses. You've got Neo in the Matrix, and in the third film he is blinded so he can understand the Matrix. And the last week, BBC splashed on its front page the arrival of yes, this was so as I was saying, there's this man who goes up Everest. Even if a blind person is not portrayed as superhuman in functioning in the world, is worthy a TV series. There's one at the moment called In the Dark, where a blind woman solves her friend's murder. And we also have the Paralympics, and that is a completely other subject. But what I would say is that blindness is so much still now, much more than not seeing. And it's about stretching the boundaries of human endurance. I think we need to move on a little bit now. So I'm going to jump a couple of thousand years and let's go to medieval times. And here we have a slide of, a very nice slide of a beautiful young girl holding her eyes on a tray, as you do. And she is St. Lucy of Syracuse, and she was alive between 283 and 304. And I call her the charitable model. And her saint's day is December the 13th, so it's coming up. And it had previously been the winter solstice. And her name, Lucy, derives from the word lux, light in Latin. And it sort of refers to her inner truth and the light she can offer the world. So and yet she's blind. So it's kind of interesting. And in some ways, having, looking, the medieval period is fascinating, and I wish I had more time to go into it with you, but she's a really good example of this, which is previously we have, Tiresias, and he had sinned and therefore got punished and became blind. What's very interesting in the Christian tradition, the Judaic Christian tradition, is that there is no backstory. You might just be born blind, it's not your parents' fault, it just could, or it could happen to you as a sort of almost gift. So the backstory issue has changed. And what I find absolutely amazing, there are thousands of blind saints. I had a whole year of blind saints. It drove me nuts. I mean, you've got Byzantine states, and you've got Lucy, you've got St. Odile, you've got Margaret of Mottola. I mean, hours of fun. But Lucy gets a lot of attention and she's picked up by Dante, Donne, also Milton, and she's venerated across the globe, pretty much to this day. And her story is very much told again and again. And she disobeyed her family, as they do, refused to marry. And in the brief life that she had, she's adamant that her God is her truth, and she doesn't give in. And her suitor, who's very rejected, reported her to the non-believing local governor, Roman, who then offered her a few ways out. She could swear allegiance to Rome, she could offer some sacrifices to the gods, and she refused. And so she was executed in 304 AD. And it's interesting, it's only a few years before Constantine actually converted to Christianity in York. Hooray! It is said the local governor removed her eyes because she said she could foresee the downfall of the Roman Empire, Diocletian. And so as you read these stories, and she's just one, as I say, of many, I thought, blind women, hooray, great. And I also thought it could be motivating. I could understand that a blind woman could have power and, allow people to become themselves, to help others, particularly if you believed in that particular religious stream. And it's kind of nice to know you can pray to someone who looks like you. You think, oh yes, there's St. Lucy. But while the wave of good feeling about saints can carry you so far, it also can clash with reality. And, while I totally admire St. Lucy and I love all the paintings, I also found myself considering, not only did they all have horrible deaths, not something necessarily blind people want, and so their blindness didn't help them, and their life didn't become better because of blindness. But also, I mean, who can be perfect? I mean, she never moaned, she never groaned. We don't know if she had a bad day. And I think a saint's life doesn't really help my connection to the past. It just makes me further away from it. And I think the way, when we ask this question, why does blind history matter? Well, guess what, guys? Look at the crop of charity adverts now on your TV, daytime TV, which some of us watched during COVID. And you'll just see how awful this notion of blindness is again perpetuated. Some nonprofits even ask sighted people to blindfold themselves and have a friend give them an identified object amount of cash and then attempt to pay for something with the money, proving just how hard and onerous your life is. And one charity recently asked to take care of their child for 1 minute with a blindfold, suggesting it's so dangerous and so difficult for a blind person that no one should risk it. And I actually I'm registered on Twitter and it says I'm blindish, which I think is quite a sort of general sort of description of me. And this Twitter suddenly messaged me, I could have a free Bible audio player, especially for me, as I was so impoverished from losing my sight. You know, don't sighted people get that too? I mean, it's really interesting. So what I'm saying is that even just with these two examples, Nandi and St. Lucy, the way that blindness is represented, even by the greats, you just kind of make you feel lonely and depressed as a blind person now. And you have so little in common with this. So, you know, what if you're not a saint and you're not cured? Where does that leave you metaphorically? And are you unloved, uncared for? Are you object of pity? And you're only allowed to be an object of pity in a charity fest or a charity advert. Marjorie, can I ask you for time, my dear, because I can't see it. Nope, don't worry. I can't see the time, but
you've got
anyway.
about 10 more minutes.
Right, dashing on. So next question, next person is one of my favorite historical figures. And on our slide, we have an image of a very beautiful 18th century woman, maybe not so beautiful, but stately, I would say. And she's in a very beautiful sort of 18th century frock, which is pale yellow silk lined with, I think, lace, and she's bedecked with pearls. She's got some seriously good pearls, good eyebrows, I think, too, silver hair. So this is obviously her later on in life. And I love this story because, and this is actually what I wrote my opera around, because this is the story of someone we've never heard of and yet was absolutely everywhere between about 1760 to her death in 1824. And so Maria Theresa von Paradis is a musician, a composer. She's born in Vienna and she becomes blind when she's very young, but she has talent. And the Empress decides to back her. And so she becomes as famous as Mozart. And in 1773, she was so admired, it was said that Mozart composed piano concertos for her, Antonio Salieri taught her, and also we have Haydn. She wrote over 30 sonatas, 5 operas, and she died in 1824 in her 60s, having established one of the leading schools for blind musicians in Europe. But most of her work is lost. There's only about 20% left. And on the next slide, I think this is why. So she was treated, the Enlightenment, as most of us think of it, was obviously a time of data and surgery and medicine. And it became a period of great excitement of the prospect of what man could do for human, quote, suffering. And one of the doctors who treated her, Theresa, was Anton Mesmer. That was where we get the word mesmerized. He used to wave magnets over people and play his harmonium. And apparently little women fainted with excitement. Anyway, so Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer says that he could cure her. She goes and lives with him, and he says he cures her. And for about 3 weeks, the whole of Vienna is excited and over the moon. And then it turns out that if she could see, then the Empress wouldn't need to give her pension. And her father took her away from Dr. Mesmer. She said her sight went away again and the blindness came back. Funny that. And Mesmer got chased out of Vienna and he ended up in Berlin and then Paris, where he was also questioned about whether he really could help anyone. But what I find really sad about her story is that the reason we know about her is her medical treatment. It's not because of her genius and her talent. We know about her because Mesmer wrote notes, we've got the Baron's letters, and it was also reported in the Times in London as the blind enchantress. She was called the blind enchantress. So we know about her, but we know about her because she was an object to be fixed. And yet the facts about her life are really interesting. She chose, after being treated by Mesmer, she got up, went on tour for 10 years all across Europe, then came back, completely stopped composing, completely stopped touring, and started a school for blind kids, of which she left enough money that it continued for many, many years afterwards. So she chose a life which I consider a musical life. It was not, it's interesting that we don't remember her in her musical capacity, but in her medical capacity. And so I found that interesting, simply because disability is often interpreted as something that needs to be fixed, and yet she chose to live her life and be a composer.
And Selina, sorry, do you think you could just describe Dr.
Oh,
Mesmer?
sorry. Dr. Mesmer is, so that on our left here, we have a picture of Dr. Mesmer. He is definitely sort of an 18th century character with a wig, a silver wig on. It's a black and white, I think a sort of etching of him. And he's wearing a frock coat with a frilly shirt underneath. And he's got a double chin, I think, or is that just shadows? And he looks quite austere, actually. I don't think I'd like to be treated by him. So I think the reason I find Theresa so important as a character, A, she was real, she wasn't fictional. And while we don't have first person commentary from her, we know that other composers, such as Mozart, knew her and wrote about her. And we've got lovely letters from Nannerl, Mozart's sister, going, hello, you know, lovely, how is she? And yes, that blindness was her unique selling point, but I don't think it seems from the action she took, she chose to live a musical life, which I've said. I've got one more person to talk about. Hopefully I'm okay with time. And we're just going to move on to her, another woman. I think there's another part of me wants to write a whole other book about blind women, but that's another story. So the woman who, and this is interesting, Adele, this is there's a image on our screen of a French book, a cover of a French book, which says Un jeune aveugle dans la France dans le 18e siècle. And it refers to a book that was found completely by accident in the back of a cupboard of a blind institution. And it turned out this young woman, who was a novelist, was a member of a blind school establishment. And she wrote more than a dozen novels. She wrote an autobiography, and they were dictated through different people. We know that the handwriting changed. And we know this was discovered by these amazing historians, one lady called Zina Weygand, who I worship and adore, and Catherine Kudlick from America. And they found this and they realized what it was and they translated it. And it really is the first French language book by a blind person about her blindness. And she dies in 1831, really sadly, after a fire in her house. Next slide. And we've had it translated. It's now in English. And this is just a quote. One of the few things that I absolutely love is that you really are hearing from a woman from her own voice without other people telling her what to say. Since I promised to speak sincerely, I should also add that a certain degree of coquettishness enter into how we carry ourselves. And here I speak of female companions of misfortune, so still buying into the blind thing being bad. When we are confident enough to be clothed in a pretty dress and a dainty shoe and decked out in these luxurious things, we're so worried about how well we look. We thus inspire tender emotions in people to console us, feel sorry for us, when in fact they should be punishing us for our pride. So I love that. It just gives you a sense of voices from the hillside of history, and we just found them by accident. Next one.
And just before you go on to the next slide, just to say that was the English book cover, wasn't it?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes,
there was
there's on the slide. I was reading you the quote, but on the left-hand side, there's an English translation of the French book, and it's called "Reflections: The Life and Workings of a Young Blind Woman in Post-Revolutionary France." Very good reading, particularly about clothes. I'm going to dash through this because I think we're running out of time. But another woman just worth mentioning, on the slide in front of us, we have a picture of Elizabeth Bessie Gilbert. She was nicknamed Bessie, and she is, it's a daguerreotype, so, and it's got a sign signed by her. She was it's a black and white type image, and she's wearing sort of old-fashioned glasses, and she's got long, smooth hair. I can't really see what she's wearing, but it's sort of like a cloak, I think. Anyway, it's just very elegant 19th century pose, quite formalized, quite statuesque. And what changes, we get much more information in the 19th century. So we not only do we get Adele Husson, who we've just seen, we also get Bessie Gilbert, 1826 to 1885. She's smart, she's educated. Her father's the master of a college in Oxford, and she grows up being told by her parents, you've got to dress yourself, you've got to sort yourself out. Please, you know, get on with it. And what she does is very clever. She starts something called the Association for the Promoting of the General Welfare of the Blind, which I know is a mouthful. It actually gets reduced, and today it still exists. It's called Clarity, and it was started in Holborn in 1854, and it was run a subscription charity. But every single person, it was basically a factory that made brooms, brushes, anything that you could create with your hands, and it was run for and by blind people, and she started it being blind herself. The only sighted person was the man at the door who checked the things as they went out. Next slide. And that's on this slide is a picture of a book that was written by her. It was a bestseller in 1923 called Elizabeth Gilbert and Her Work for the Blind by Frances Martin. And I mean, she was really a savvy woman. She knew that her life was going to be difficult in terms of how society treated her. And one of the things this biography reports is the letters that she wrote to her father. And she was sort of given this role of spinster aunt. And that's, oh, I'm so sorry, my timer has gone off. But she didn't want to do that. And again, like Theresa, she had her own life and she made a decision how she would work. And created these factories. Next slide. I'm not going to read you, this is a slide that is me ranting on, but basically it is about, what I really want to say here is that what these four women have shown us, and these four case studies in a sense, is that we can challenge our conventional notions of blindness. And I think there are real questions concerning about how blind people are represented in the past, particularly because the last 100 years, the histories of blind people is basically like you're deficient, you're a hero, or you're inspirational, or you're a burden. There's never just like, you're normal, you're part of the world. Next slide. So I guess I wanted to summarize, why do these stories and other ones help us look at blindness? And I said, I think they challenge how blind people were seen and they were mythologized. I think it's a challenge of really that people had lives away from being medical and scientific, part of medical and scientific debate. And blind people are individuals, and we are a group, we are a group of humans who have desires and dreams just like the rest of everyone. And I think the passes tend to boutique us and put us over there in the corner. I think what I would say to myself is it's been a wonderful journey learning about this, but it's also sad that there's not more voices. And I think there are some out there. One more slide, I think. And then the question is, well, why do we need these stories? Well, I think most of the people watching this today will have heard of a woman called Helen Keller, who was a disabled activist. And she was blind, she was non-speaking, and she was deaf. And the woman, she's amazing. She goes to Harvard, she writes books. And about 4 months ago, somebody wrote on Twitter, and it got retweeted 6 million times, that she was a fraud and she couldn't have done any of these things, without help and support. And basically she was a fraud. And I just thought, this is why we need to have these stories, because it's not just about Helen Keller, it's about all of us. And so we do need evidence, and we need data, and we need authentic voices that tell us the past. Next slide.
Was that a photograph of Helen Keller or an image?
I'm a bad audio describer. It's a woman in a white shirt with beautiful cuffs. I think it sort of looks slightly silky, and she's sniffing a rose. And I don't know if the picture shows, she's got her hand below, and it's reading Braille. And she's got she's quite young, and it's quite a sensitive, gentle photo of a young woman reading Braille. And it's definitely staged. It's a staged portrait. Is that right, Marge?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So I think just before I go, and please do send me questions or ask me questions. I think one thing I'm being very careful of is that I can't speak for all blind and visually impaired people. There are many more blind stories out there, and there's a whole spectrum of sight loss, blindness, being blind, going blind, what it does to you, how it makes you feel. And there's no way any kind of history would capture all of it. But what I do think I can do is it can influence us now and challenge us and give us different ways of thinking how sight loss does come in different shapes, sizes, levels of blur, and has always done so. Last slide. And I think, given that it's Disability History Week, I often want to say Disability International Day of Disability Week. It's not just for Christmas, you know, we're here, we're not going anywhere. And I think if you're going to write history, it should be nothing about us without us, which is, it's very difficult to find these new voices. There's an image here, which is a banner, which a lot of disabled people use as a mantra, which has in hand, I think in sort of with a big pen, nothing about us without us. And as much as you can try, I think it's very important to do so, but I do know it's hard. I don't think it's easy. And I also think there's going to be a lot of filtering as we go through looking for voices. And I do know that we're sort of looking, I found this very interesting quote by Douglas Murray, who said, "We may have the same human passions and flaws as our predecessors, but our preconceptions, our preoccupations and priorities have often been so different." So I really like to sort of think about that. The lens that I'm looking at blind history is through my lens, and my lens may be very different from the lens of the past. So I really hope, I know it's a very rushed in terms of too many case studies, not enough time, but I hope it's given you a sense of what we need to do and how hard, you know, what we can do and how it can challenge us and shape how we are now. And I'm really happy to talk about any questions, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Selina, that you've given us so much to think about. That was so interesting. Thank you very much. Now, there are some questions that have come in. So I'm just going to get the ball rolling myself with something that has struck me throughout your talk, which is notions and metaphors and allusions to seeing and not seeing are, you know, you used it yourself at the very, very end. You referred to looking at blindness through different lenses. Mm-hmm. And I suppose what we need to learn from what you've been telling us today is how we need to put voices of blind people or partially sighted people in the mix of what we are listening to. Mm-hmm. But how do we adjust those metaphors and the way that we respond? Because when somebody climbs Everest, it's amazing, and although the news will tell us that it is even more amazing that a blind person has done it, and so how do we kind of put those two together?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer quickly, but I think the way I would answer it was, I would think about why we want these people to be so successful because they're blind. I think already climbing Everest is quite a feat in itself. So, you know, why does it have to be, you know, what if you're not like that? I think that's the thing, is like, the majority of people who are blind are not going to climb Everest, are not going to be the Paralympics, are not going to be superstar composers. The majority of us are just trying to get out of bed every day, go to work. You know, I think it's some really crazy statistic about how many blind people are not in work. And I'm not saying work is the only reason to be, but what I would say is, I think we need to distinguish between something that's brilliant and successful in its own right, but connecting it to blindness. And that's the danger, because otherwise, what are you setting like this standard of like, okay, you all have to go climb Everest? I don't want to climb Everest. So that would be the first part. I think in terms of language, I have no problems with the visual metaphor of, you know, seeing. I mean, the notion of sight and understanding are interlinked, and we can't change that. It's part of our vocabulary. But what we can do is talk about blindness in a more positive way. So at the moment, you know, even now, it's a deficit. It's a negative thing. And I would say there's a really good professor called Hannah Thompson at London University, and she would call it blind advantage or blind positives, which is, you know, there are things that you are gaining out of us, of us lot having blindness. So my phone is absolutely phenomenal, because some of the technology they invented for blind people, you all are now using. So I'm trying, or I guess I'm trying to shift the tectonic plates a bit. So no one gets slapped, no one gets told off for using see and not see or whatever. That doesn't matter. What really matters is how our perception, our understanding of blindness can be neutral. I think that's the thing, is that it's not neutral, it's always extreme.
That's really, that actually brings us on nicely to a question from Stephanie, who says, thank you for the interesting talk. And she says, do you think Christian theology has a lot to do with how blindness and disability is perceived? The idea of suffering being a beautiful thing because it brings us closer to God, so that therefore is seen as inspirational.
Well, I would even go back further. I would say Judaic Christian, because you've got dark and light. And in the beginning, God said light was good. So dark, bad. And if you think blindness is darkness, you're going to think it's bad. So the binary opposition was set up pretty early on. The suffering, the caritas issue, yes, massively difficult. Because if you see blindness as deficient, as negative, as terrible, as tragedy, of course, part of the Christian doctrine is to help those who are have less chances than you do. And there's tons of metaphors in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, of people being cured. Jesus touches their eyes. I think there's about 4 stories of Jesus curing people. But again, it puts seeing as truth and blindness as not truth. So yes, yes. Definitely. The answer to your question is definitely is yes.
And we have another question here saying, do people who have lost one of their senses have the ability to use their other senses to overcompensate, or is this an urban myth? I think
urban myth, urban myth, urban myth, urban myth. What I would say is that you use your senses. It's not overcompensate. It's not about compensation. It's about using what you have. So, for example, I have a friend who has 3 fingers and he writes with his finger like this. So he's not overcompensated. He's just writes with 3 fingers.
Another question, so have you looked at the history of Sir John Fielding, the reformer?
Oh, I love him. Yes, he. I think he's a judge in 18th century. So the 18th century boomed with blind stars. Again, he's a bit of a blind star. So there was Theresa as my woman example, but there's Professor Nicholas Saunderson at Cambridge, who had the same role that Stephen Hawking had. And there was John Fielding, who was a judge, a lawyer, and an advocate for many people. But I think he kind of bought into the Victorian, early Victorian, or sort of late Enlightenment, whichever way you look at it, notion of blindness being overcome. So he kind of perpetuated that a bit, but he was a magnificent fellow.
Wonderful. And we've got time for one last question, which is, do you know about the blind harpers of Ireland?
Ooh, no. Send, please.
So we can all go away then and find out.
Because there are blind harpists on the tombs in Egypt. There are hieroglyphics of people playing the harp, and their eyes are banded, and we think it means that they were blind. So obviously, being a blind harper, harp. Do you mean harp as in harp?
Harpist. Yeah.
Yes, harpist. Yes, amazing, absolutely. Thank you. I will go look it up.
Wonderful. So, well, I just have time then before we all disappear to say a huge thank you to Selina. It's been very, very interesting, and I think we will all be going and buying your book. When does it come out, Selina?
Oh no, yes, June 2023.
So we have to wait a whole 6 months, but it's at the printers and it's on its way out.
You're the first people I've talked to about this, so thank you so much for having me and letting me rant away, because it's a subject I'm absolutely passionate about, so thank you.
Oh, well, the book is called Life Unseen, A Story of Blindness, and we'll all be really interested to read it. Thank you.
And there'll be an audiobook version as well, so don't worry, if you don't want to read it, you can lie in bed and sleep to it. Thank you very much, Marjorie, for having me, and thank you for the University of York.